I clearly remember the first time I experienced anti-Semitism. I was third grade. There was a boy in my class, I think his name was David. I'm not going to tell you his last name because I don't want you to Google him. Can you imagine? Poor guy. He was a bulldog of a boy. He was short and wide, but tough and a little scary to third grader me. We weren't friends, we weren't enemies, but I kept my distance from him. One day as I'm walking home from school, through the athletic fields that are near my elementary, towards my house, I don't have a memory of anyone else being there, just him and I on this path, and he was about 20, 30 feet, I think, behind me. And he yells, "Hey, kike." Now, the funny thing is, I didn't know that word at that point in my life. I didn't know that that was a bad word you call Jews, but I knew it was wrong. I knew it was bad, and I knew it had something to do with me being Jewish. So, of course, what does third grade boy go home and do? I tell my mom and dad, and there gets stirred a lot of energy in the household, and I'm not sure what they did. I'm sure there was a call to school. I'm not sure to his parents. I don't think there was ever any restorative justice or apology or things like that. But I remember it clearly. I remember it distinctly, the experience, the feelings. And there was an external experience, obviously, because this kid was yelling nasty things at me. And I told my parents, and it got involved in the school and impacted the classroom and how I interacted with him. And there was conversations at the dinner table, and there was this external reaction that, I don't know, I think was mostly appropriate, but knowing my family, maybe also emotional too, I don't know. If my mother's listening, she's going to be mad that I said that. But then there was this internal piece too. I'm walking home from school. Now I have to tell you, I lived in a day and age when I actually went home for lunch between morning and afternoon. I walked home. My mom made me lunch, and then we went back. So I was back and forth. That was a safe place. And in that moment, something shifted. I don't know if broke's too strong, but there was a piercing of a invincibility that I didn't even know that even was there, being invincible. There was a vulnerability. There was a powerlessness that this other classmate of mine all of a sudden had just changed my trajectory, my way I thought I sat in the world. Now, the third grader me wasn't reflecting on those things in that moment. I look back, and I remember. Well, you know how impactful it can be. I'm third grade was a few years ago, and I remember it well. I remember what he said. I remember the commotion it stirred outside, and I remember what it felt like inside. So this has been quite a year for this stuff. This terrible, awful, hateful words and actions and stances and signs and violence that come from this thing we call anti-Semitism. You can check out the numbers. The Anti-Defamation League, well, I don't have to tell you, you know. In 2013, there were 751 anti-Semitic incidents. In 2023, there were 8,873. Over a 1,000% increase. You know what you've maybe experienced yourself or by a degree of separation if you sent or someone close to you has gone to college. Maybe you heard a story or you have a concern. Maybe you've been in other communities, other places that you've been allied with on so many other issues, and then you hear comments or see statements that jar you and say, what's going on here? In so many ways, it's been a year like no other. Even someone like me who strives not to be overreactive has found myself reacting. Truth is, as bad as this year's been, unfortunately it's been worse. And it's never not been. As long as there's been a group of people called Jews or Israelites or Hebrews, we may not have called ourselves Jews, and it may not have called it Antisemitism, but this thing's been around as long as we have been around. So as bad and hard as this year has been, what do we do with that? I feel it's my purview not to speak with great authority or expertise on the external pieces. There are thoughtful people and institutions in our community who help us try to understand how to respond to antisemitism, how to respond to what's going out there in the world. I feel like my purview is more what happens within. That thing that I just described to you, that vulnerability, that powerlessness. When you hear the word or see the swastika or get blindsided by someone saying something you didn't expect to say. And it just makes you feel it's not rational, it's unsettled and unsafe and unfair. What do we do with this? Well, I feel like there's some framework, at least internally, that internal response in our liturgy tonight, in the prayer that our service is named for. Kol Nidrei. It's a peculiar prayer. We are released of vows that we have made. Or if you get technical and literal with the language, it's actually looking ahead to the vows that we will make. Now, one of the legends, the mythology around this prayer, speaks perfectly to this question of responding to antisemitism, the external response, the internal response, and what we do when we experience that powerlessness. The mythology is that this prayer was written for and said by those Jews who were forced to reject their Judaism and convert to Christianity. So that in those secret, private moments when they had to do this difficult, destructive, awful external thing, they would be internally released. Because when we get to that point of powerlessness, we're going to do a lot of things because we're not thinking straight. Think about it. When you feel powerlessness, when you feel powerless, when you are vulnerable, when you are scared, I'm going to promise a lot of things, whether that's to who is making me scared or to some other direction. Oh, if I just get out of this, I will never do that again. Oh, if I could just be saved through this, then I promise I'm going to do these things. Or maybe in that we're so fearful for our own well-being that we make a vow and promise to react violently to that person who's in front of us. Maybe it's with verbal violence. Maybe we're so scared and frightened that we choose to hate whoever that other is and those like them. I could go on, but this is what happens when we are in that moment. I don't think it's just limited to moments of antisemitism. I think we all can identify with that in other moments where we feel powerless. We want to lash out and commit to things that we would never commit to or promise or vow to in those more calm, thoughtful moments. Well, Kol Nidrei forgives us for that. Kol Nidrei recognizes that is a very human thing you do in that moment. We're built, deeply wired to respond in such a way in those powerless moments when we fear for our very well-being, whether it be physical or emotional or even spiritual. So Kol Nidrei says, you are not only forgiven, you are absolved. But that's only part of it. Because it's just not a, okay, get out of jail free card. It's done in a context of a relationship. A relationship with something bigger, something broader, something grander than us. Some people call that God, divinity, the holy, the sacred. Whatever mysterious cosmic forces are bigger than us, that somehow the wisdom of our tradition taps into and pushes and strives for us to be more than just this powerlessness response. And so Kol Nidrei says, yes, and. Yes, you're released from this vow, this promise you made in that terrible, awful moment, which I get how you feel, and it makes sense. And maybe the next time you can experience that powerlessness in a different way. Maybe you can see something in that you couldn't see before. I know it's hard, and most likely you'll do it again, because that's why the prayer is written in the future tense, not the past tense. Now, where do I take this from? Our tradition, both ancient and contemporary, addresses this moment of powerlessness. I mean, goodness, our people have had a lot of experience not dealing with not just with the Antisemetism, but when that becomes institutionalized and manifests towards taking away our freedoms and our safety and our security and sometimes our very lives. So as we look back to our tradition, what to do with this, what maybe possibly could we consider internally in these moments? I'll start with the mystics. They have a crazy idea about how the world was created. That all there was this God thing, whatever word you want to use for it. And the way that the universe was created was called Tzimtzum. God was everywhere, expansive, and then God contracted. Now, one way to look at this is the way the world was created by God removing the divine power. God was not expansive and in control and managing and sovereign over everything. God withdrew. God leaned into the divine powerlessness. Now, these mystics are a little hard to understand and even explain in a short setting like that, but what I'm hoping at least you'll accept the promise to consider is that there's possibility in powerlessness. In that moment, when we feel so vulnerable, we feel so frightened and scared, and our instinct tells us to respond, react, fight back, make a vow or promise to do those things to the person in the moment and anyone else who ever do that to us again. Maybe there's more. Like I said, we've had lots of experience in these types of moments. Maybe one of the most well-known in in our history is that of the Shoah, the Holocaust. And from that, a hero of a human being who I've spoken about before, and maybe you've come across him and read his work, Man in Search of Meaning, named Viktor Frankle. Viktor Frankle lived in the most insidious, terrible manifestation of antisemitism. He was writing this book about the meaning of life and how to make meaning when he was taken captive to the concentration camp. And there, instead of giving up and despairing, he actually wrote the book in his mind and tried to use the experience to understand what it was he was trying to say and trying to mean. It's a powerful read if you ever want to read it. But to me, Viktor Frankl speaks to us about this powerlessness. Because in that moment, in those moments of those terrible atrocities that we've all heard the stories about, Viktor Frankl still came around to, even in those moments, when human beings have been maybe in some of their most awful, frightening, vulnerable moments, Viktor Frankl says, you still have a choice about how you respond to that moment. The last of human freedoms, he said, is the ability to choose one's attitude in a given set of circumstances. So even in those moments where you feel that attack, that fear, that the world's coming to get me or us once again, there's something else to consider. I know. There's still external, real circumstances. The safety of myself and the people I care about. The viability of the society and institutions in which I value and support. Those are all real. And maybe there's a little door ajar, a window open, a sliver of light to continue to consider that there's potential and power in that feeling of powerlessness. Another great figure of our last century, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who was the chief rabbi of Britain from 1991 to 2013, wrote extensively about many things. But one of the things he spoke about is our interdependence and connectivity to one another. Not just Jews to Jews, but humans to humans. And Rabbi Sachs suggests that the opportunity in vulnerability is to have a clearer eye and mind on that connection to other vulnerable people. That as awful and frightening as that experience might be, those moments are potential to connect us and partner us to discover and remember our true nature, this interdependence and interconnectedness. Specifically about anti-Semitism, Rabbi Sachs said this: the victim of anti-Semitism is not just the Jew. It is our collective humanity. The victim of anti-Semitism is our shared responsibility to one another. The victim of anti-Semitism is our belief that we can live together in peace. Maybe, just maybe, in those moments when it is and feels so desperately about us, there's an opportunity, a possibility to see that it's more. As I think about that singular, notable point in our history, the Shoah and the Holocaust, there's another story of this that embodies how to respond in such fear and vulnerability and powerlessness. You probably know the name of Meep Gees, but you definitely know the name of the young woman who she sheltered in the Netherlands, Anne Frank. Meep Gees wasn't Jewish. She didn't directly experience anti-Semitism, but the Netherlands in World War II was potentially a place of powerlessness for her, of danger for her and her family. And we know what she did. in that moment, in those moments, those constant moments in which Kol Nidrei would say to her, it's okay if you promise to run, to flee, to bury your head in the sand, to promise to stay away from those Jews because they're dangerous to me and my family, and yet Meep Gees did something different. She wrote, I was always afraid, every day, every hour, every minute. I was afraid for everybody, but you just did what you had to do. Sounds simple, but we all know it's not. We all know what that feels like. And I don't stand with you tonight on the precipice of this last year that was so hard, and it looks like this next year is going to continue that way. In a Pollyannish way, say, oh, the world's okay, and we don't have to worry about these things. We do. There are external concerns to this very real reality of how we respond and how we partner and how we combat and all those things that feel and are threatening. And in addition to those, and I ask you to consider the possibility in those moments, in your fear, in your vulnerability, in that ultimate powerlessness, that you consider that there's another path, that there's potential there for creation, that there's possibility there in the power of choice. That there's an opening for us to partner and connect and align with our highest values of remembering the stranger, the widow, the orphan, and everyone amongst us human beings who is vulnerable, who is scared, who is fearful, who is powerless. Just consider. I wish I could say with any great confidence that you won't have those moments before you, but I can't, and I won't. Be safe. Keep your arms and heads around your loved ones. And open your hearts in those moments to the possibilities of powerlessness. Amen.